When I was a kid, my father would take me hunting. It was always one of my favorite things to do with him. We would grab our rifles, load up the truck, and drive out to some property our family owned to hunt for the day. Once we got to the property, we would hop on our four-wheeler and drive a couple miles deeper into the woods. My dad always took his pistol with him whenever we would go hunting, just in case we ran into some kind of predator. Even if we didn't see anything, just sitting in the quiet woods with my father was enough for me. But when we did kill a deer, or whatever we were hunting, it brought so much excitement to the both of us. We would get the shakes and I could feel how proud he was of me every time. I can almost remember every hunt we went on together. It really created a bond between us. Quite a few years have passed now and I've grown up to have a family of my own, but I still think about those hunting trips. Then one day I got the news that I prayed would never come. Another hunter had found my dad dead. He had gone out to our old hunting grounds by himself, which I had begged him not to do just in case something like this happened, but he was stubborn in his old age. As he was leaving, he had lost his way in the dark and drove the four-wheeler off a cliff. My mother had passed a few years prior and I am an only child, so I had to go identify the body. When I saw my father, he was almost unrecognizable. The detective said that he had been there for a while and most likely some wild animals had got to him first. It was worse than I could have possibly imagined. He was so disfigured and dismembered that it was like a pack of bears had tore him apart. The only reason that I knew for sure it was my father was because of a tattoo he had on what was left of his arm. It was the words "my buddy" with my handprint beside it from when I was a baby. The detectives also said that when they found him, he had his pistol in his hand with an empty magazine. Apparently he had been alive after he drove off the cliff and probably used the pistol to try and signal for help. Hearing this destroyed me. I should have been there. I should have went with him and maybe this wouldn't have happened. My dad was cremated and we had a small funeral. Saying goodbye to my dad was one of the hardest things that I've ever gone through. After the funeral was over and we were home, I decided that I would go hunting with my dad one more time. The next morning I got up before the sun rose. I kissed my wife and son goodbye and told them I would be back later that night and that I loved them. Then I grabbed a small Ziploc bag, went to my father's urn, and poured some of his ashes into the bag. I finished packing up the truck and went on my way back to where my father and I had been hunting since I was a kid. The same place where my father would take his last breath. When I got there, all of these old memories came flooding back. I was going to have one last hunting trip with my dad. My heart was heavy, but I hopped on the four-wheeler and continued on my journey into the woods. When I got to our old tree stand, I stopped and looked around. Not much had changed. It was like I had stepped back in time to when I had been here as a kid. I took a breath and started climbing up the tree stand. When I reached the top, I was surprised to see that my dad's hunting pack was still there. He was always careful not to leave anything behind after a hunt. So this was pretty unusual. I thought to myself, must have been getting forgetful in his old age too. As I sat there, the sun began to rise and I could see the woods around me. It was peaceful. I took out my dad's ashes, poured them out, and watched the breeze carry them away. A tear fell from my eye as I said, "I love you, Dad," and then sat there in silence, listening to the world around me. I looked through my dad's bag and found an old picture of us from when I killed my first deer. It was nice knowing he had kept this in his bag after all these years. A few hours had gone by now and not much had happened. No deer had walked by, and the only other living things I saw were a couple of squirrels and some buzzards circling something in the distance. To be honest, I didn't really expect to kill anything. I really just wanted to sit and feel close to my dad. A few more hours went by and I heard it. The sound of a deer walking close to me. It's almost impossible to mistake if you know what you're listening for. I waiting for it to come into the clearing, and sure enough, here it came. It was a rather large buck, and once again I started to get the shakes. My heart was pounding and I readied my rifle. As it walked into my sights, I took a deep breath, made a quick noise to grab its attention and make it stop in its tracks, and then I fired. The shot ripped through the air and went straight into the deer's side. It wasn't a clean shot though, and the deer, though obviously injured, ran off into the woods. Guess I've gotten rusty. It was going to take some time for this deer to go down, so looks like I'm going to be doing some tracking. After a few minutes I grabbed my things and my dad's pack and loaded them onto the four-wheeler. It was going to be getting dark soon, so I better make this quick. I grabbed my pistol, a flashlight, and my knife and started tracking. I quickly found the blood trail and started following it deeper into the woods. As I was walking, I began hearing sounds. It sounded like some animal running through the trees around me, but not close enough to where I could see it. Then I heard what sounded like something trying to imitate other animals by grunting and letting out distorted screeches. This was weird, but I mean, it's the woods. There's all kinds of animals in here. I kept following the trail until it abruptly stopped. I combed the area and nothing. No sign of the deer. It was much darker now, so as much as I hated to leave without it, I needed to head back. I started my trek back to the four-wheeler when I heard the noises again, but this time they were much closer than before. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. That somber, reminiscent feeling I had earlier had been replaced with confusion and fear. I picked up my pace so I could get back as fast as possible. It was completely dark now. The only light I had to guide me was the moon and my flashlight. All of a sudden I heard a loud thud directly behind me. I quickly turned around to see the deer I had shot, lying on the ground a meat 20 feet in front of me. Where did this thing come from? I hadn't passed it before. It was like it had just fell from the sky. I inched my way closer until I was right on top of it. Something was wrong, very wrong. It had been mutilated. Its insides were ripped out and it was covered in slashes and what looked like bite marks. In my panic and confusion, I didn't hear the sound coming from nearby, until I was standing over the deer. It sounded like chewing. I looked all around to find where it was coming from, but I didn't see anything. Then I felt something hit the back of my neck. Something warm and red. It was blood. I heard a loud crack and then it hit me. The sound wasn't coming from around me, it was coming from above me. I slowly looked up into the trees above, and what I saw looked like a scene straight out of a movie. There was blood and guts strewn out through the branches, and then my light fell on where the sound was coming from. I saw what looked like a very large, pale white, humanoid creature. It had long nails like daggers and a large mouth filled with shark-like teeth. It was eating the deer's heart. Then its gaze met mine, and I could see that its eyes were solid black. It gave me an evil smile, like it was about to do something sinister, something it had done many times before. It began to turn its body towards me, blood dripping from its face and hands. It moved into position, like a cat getting ready to pounce, and after a moment of silence it let out a blood-curdling scream. And I knew, the hunt was on. I broke into a sprint, running as fast as I could to get back to my four-wheeler. But this thing was fast, too fast for me to beat in a foot race. It was jumping from tree to tree, screaming, and what sounded like laughing the whole time. I could feel it getting closer and closer with each bound it took. I could hear the branches bending and snapping as it glided through them with ease. In my haste I had lost where I was. I kept running and running as fast as I could, hoping to catch a glimpse of something familiar. But then I reached a cliff and I skidded to a stop. I looked over and could see something. It was old crime scene tape. This must have been where my dad died. I thought to myself, this is it for me. There was nowhere else I could go. I turned around to face this thing head on. I couldn't run anymore. At this point I had only one other option. If I'm going to survive this and have any chance of seeing my family again, I had to face this thing head on. It leapt out of the trees and landed roughly 15 yards in front of me. I slowly reached down to my hip and retrieved my pistol. This was it, I was going to die. It let out a low growl and positioned itself onto all fours. In an instant it was darting towards me in full stride. I had to think fast. It leapt at me with its arms wide open, ready to take me down. I quickly dived to the right, just barely missing its grasp. And I fired a shot. Bang! The thing let out a pained scream and tumbled past me, falling over the cliff. I couldn't believe it. I was alive. Not only was I alive, but I had actually managed to take this thing down. I looked over the cliff to see the thing writhing in pain at the bottom. I took this opportunity to run back to where I could remember coming from. Eventually I did find where I had been, and I retraced my steps back to the tree stand and four-wheeler. The pained screams of the thing had faded out, so I quickly hopped on the four-wheeler, started it up, and began making my way back out of the woods. As I was flying down the trail back to my truck, I spotted something in my headlights. But it wasn't the thing that had been trying to kill me before. It was a man. I could tell he was naked, very dirty, and clearly injured. As I got closer, the man looked familiar. It couldn't be, it's impossible. I just spread his ashes. It was my dad. I slammed on the brakes, nearly causing the four-wheeler to flip in the process. I ran over to my dad and looked at him. He was bleeding from his side and in a lot of pain. How are you alive?" He looked at me and said, "Please help me," and then staggered to the ground. I quickly dove to help him back up. When he reached his arm out to me for support, I noticed something was missing. His tattoo. It wasn't there. My blood ran cold and I took a few steps back. This wasn't my father. I pulled out my knife, continued walking back and said, "You're not my father." He looked at me with that evil grin I had seen earlier in the trees, and then he began to convulse. I watched as his skin began to rip and tear away. The sounds of bones breaking and flesh falling to the ground was almost too much for my stomach to handle. This thing tore off what looked like my father's skin to reveal the same thing I had seen before. It lunged at me, so I stuck out my knife and I felt the blade pierce the creature's chest. It fell on top of me and I felt a searing pain shoot into my shoulder. The creature laid on me motionless, but not before I had been bitten. I rolled it off of me and quickly ran back to the four-wheeler and continued flying down the path. When I reached my truck, a wave of relief rushed over me. It was over. I could go home, get some help, and report the incident to the authorities. I didn't bother loading everything back into the truck. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as humanly possible. I got in and floored it out of there. On my way home, the burning in my shoulder kept getting worse. The pain was almost unbearable. My vision started to go blurry and I kept falling in and out of consciousness. But I had to stay awake. I had to fight this and make it back home. I finally pulled into the house and ran to go inside. My wife met me at the door. She had been worried sick, and for good reason. She saw that I was obviously shaken up and hurt. She began frantically asking what happened and, "Are you okay? What's wrong?" I told her I'm okay, but to call the police. My wife did as I had asked and called 911. My son was crying over all the commotion and my wife took him to his room to try and keep him calm. I reassured her that everything was going to be fine, and then I went to take a shower and clean my wound before the police showed up. As I got into the shower, the pain hadn't subsided and I was still in and out of consciousness. As I was washing myself off, I noticed that my hair was falling out in big clumps and the skin around where I had been bitten was beginning to peel off. On top of that, my teeth and nails began to fall out as if something was pushing them out from underneath. The whole experience was excruciating. I screamed for my wife and she ran into the bathroom and flung open the shower curtain. When I looked at her, all I saw was red. Then she let out a blood-curdling scream and I lost consciousness. Next thing I know, I wake up in prison strapped to a bed and I'm facing 7 counts of murder. 2 officers, 3 paramedics, and my wife and son. I don't know how I got here or what happened after I blacked out. I feel different. I feel angry. I feel volatile. I feel stronger. My senses feel enhanced. But most of all, I feel hungry. I don't know what happened to me, but there is one thing that I know for sure. The hunt is on.